when I still had my office there in that hat building, the director's offices were made in such a way that if you were agile enough, you could actually jump up on top of those offices. And I jumped up on top of my office and I took a Sharpie and I wrote in 2004, and I gave the date that we approved our last scene. We completed the very last hand-drawn animated movie that Disney will ever make, and I signed it. And that doesn't mean anything because they gutted that whole floor and threw everything away.
Before its release, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had been nicknamed Disney's Folly, expected in many circles to fail and take casualties. Instead, the film launched the company into the stratosphere in the world's zeitgeist. As of 2018, there have been 56 animated Disney feature films, and there is no end in sight. It is the lifeblood of the Walt Disney Company. But in 2004, Disney Animation was facing an identity crisis. They were confronted with stiff competition in features for the first time in their history, from both inside and outside the company. The most obvious threat was former executive Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was dead set on revenge against his former employer. After an ugly, public, and lucrative falling out with Disney CEO Michael Eisner, Katzenberg founded DreamWorks in 1994. Shortly thereafter, he made a biblical epic and a few films that were quickly forgotten. Then the studio stumbled upon Shrek in 2001. The film's earnings were massive, and even better for Katzenberg, the movie's foundation was a bitter criticism of the saccharine Disney classics. And even better yet, Michael Eisner was drawn as the evil villain. The second threat, however, was more dangerous, and from inside the company. Disney had been distributing Pixar films since Toy Story revolutionized the industry with computer animation. Pixar movies were doing monumentally better in the press and at the box office than Disney's own 2D films. 2D animation movies simply weren't the box office juggernauts they once were. In fact, the opposite was true. From 2000 to 2003, 4 Disney animated features earned less than $100 million in the States. Most famously, there was Treasure Planet, nicknamed Treasure Plummet, which perfectly fit its $38 million gross. Worse yet, Pixar was thinking about leaving Disney and setting out on its own. Disney was only marketing and distributing the films, and Pixar was nearing the end of its 10-year, 5-film deal with Disney. Because of this relationship, Pixar was now an established household name. Disney's only leverage was that they owned the rights to the sequels and were threatening to make them without Pixar. So they pitted Pixar against itself, instead of crushing Pixar movies with, say, Disney movies, as they would have in the past. It was in this climate that Disney's Home on the Range hit theaters. Only a month before the film's release, Disney closed its animation studio in Florida, firing 258 animators. Disney assured the press that it would continue to make traditional 2D animation, but the press saw blood in the water, and it would dominate the conversation about Home on the Range. Home on the Range wouldn't be completely savaged by critics, but there were plenty of cow-based puns to express their distaste, although most critics were simply nonplussed and bemoaned the rumored end of traditional animation at Disney. Coincidentally, the film happened to be about 3 cows trying to save their beloved farm, their home, from destruction. The film didn't directly kill hand-drawn animation at the company, but distinctly marked the end of an era. The Walt Disney Company was again in uncharted territory, with its legacy on the line. But that's only part of the film's story. It's also the story of 2 directors, John Sanford and Will Finn, who try to live up to the Disney legacy in the face of tremendous obstacles that impossible legacy creates. Disney animation directors are rarely lauded and hardly praised. If they succeed, they've made a Disney film, not a John Musker film or a Clyde Geremini film or a Wolfgang Reitherman film. A Disney film, pure and simple. If the director fails, then and only then is it their film. Because to direct a Disney movie is at once a lifetime opportunity and a possible death sentence. And now the story of 2 directors, 3 cows, and $110 million.
whatever you want to know, it's up for grabs. I'll name names. I'll say uncomfortable things. So shoot. One of my problems is I have a big mouth and I like to talk. I'll be honest because I've discovered that honesty makes people laugh. I'm kind of one of those guys who will do anything for a laugh sometimes. So one of the reasons I'm dishonest about that movie and my career is that there are stories in it that make people laugh. And maybe people can take away a nugget of wisdom about how things went.
That devil-may-care attitude belongs to John Sanford. Sanford shoots from the hip. He's a lifelong animator, a fierce Trump critic on Facebook, and is a chief purveyor of gallows humor.
I don't think it's ever going to find any kind of cult following unless somebody has a fetish for like colorful Westerns. I've got 20 DVDs in my drawer. I hand them out as joke gifts now. Anytime there's a white elephant gift, somebody's getting a Home on the Range.
The man is his own biggest internet troll. Nobody wrote a review of Home on the Range as savage as that. The way he looks at his biggest professional failure is a masterclass in humility and self-reflection. Then again, maybe he's separated himself from the film and is still in denial that he directed it.
You know, like whenever I run into somebody and they say, "What have you done?" and I go through my resume, and then somebody will go, "Well, he co-directed a Disney feature," and I went, "Yeah, I directed Home on the Range." And they went, "Really? I never saw it." And I said, "Yeah, because you weren't 5. Whatever."
It's most definitely the former. His co-director on the film is Will Finn. Will has the same sense of humor and penchant for self-reflection. Will is a teacher and wants young animators to avoid the mistakes he's made in his career. He's a little bit closer to the vest than John, and there's points when he has a little bit more difficulty talking about the film.
Like I said, I try to avoid making commentary about it a lot because, like I say, it's very hard to speak for yourself on something that's a collaboration and something that has as much negative vibe out there as that film, which obviously I'm well aware of, and not happy about. But what can you do?
To recall the film is an emotional experience for him, and yet he does it with dignity and grace.
The thing about directing gigs is it's really hard to talk about them because you don't direct alone. And the other problem is the only features I've directed have all been disastrous bombs. So, I can either be accused of falling on my sword and taking all the blame, or I'll get accused of passing on blame to other people, which I don't want to do in either case. So, I'm grateful for having the experiences of directing on all 3 of the movies I've directed on. And I think they've helped me in the, in the work that I've done since. But, it's obviously a huge disappointment across the board when a film performs poorly. And they all performed quite poorly. And, fortunately, most people sooner or later just want to forget that they even happened. So I think what I learned from it is that I probably won't get to direct again.
Their years before Home on the Range are crucial to their stories because the Disney legacy they were chasing is one John and Will helped rehabilitate during the Disney Renaissance.
Well, I wanted to do animation from my earliest memory because everybody in my family drew, and I loved to draw cartoons, and all the old classic cartoons were heavily in rotation. So I went to a kind of not the most prestigious art school in the world, which is Art Institute at Pittsburgh. So I went there in 76 to 78. But the single most remarkable thing that happened was Eric Larson, who was one of Disney's 9 old men, visited the school to canvas for anybody who was interested in animation, and no one wanted to see him. Because, if anything, the school back in the late 70s discouraged people from getting into animation because people just all figured it was dying. So I got to monopolize his time for half a day and strike up a rapport with him. And he was very frank. I always say that the great thing about Eric was he offered me just as much encouragement as I deserved, because he told me my portfolio was weak and I wouldn't be able to get hired with what I had in my kit at the time. But he said, when you do graduate, you got to get out to California whatever way possible. possible. And you can write to me, you can call me. He says, because despite the shortcomings in your portfolio, I can tell your passion for this is very genuine, and that's as important in some cases. I managed to ride share out to California in October '78 and couch surfed around LA. And the first time I got to visit the Disney studio in person was on my 20th birthday in 1978. And I got to show Eric what I was doing. And I think I submitted 3 formal portfolios and 5 informals that never made it through the door. So a total of 5 tries. And then finally I got a foot in the door at the studio in the training program. This is in 79 now. And that was sort of the start. It was a rocky start because I was kind of a borderline case. The training program was very strenuous, and a couple people I came through it with got thrown off pretty quickly, but I managed to hang on by the skin of my teeth. But, the competition was fierce. I'd been there a month when Tim Burton started. So, Tim Burton, came out of CalArts with an entourage already dusting his shoulders with a whisk broom. So, he was already a superstar, and I was kind of a low man on the totem pole. What you did was you were in there for 8 weeks. And you worked with Eric. The trainees were in a room right off of his office. You're supposed to make a short piece of film that demonstrated something and could do whatever you wanted to. And the first thing I did ran almost a minute, which was excessively long. But it was a little man who sort of looked like Robert Benchley, and he was having trouble with a vending machine. It's sort of a long and unremarkable thing, but it was where I finally got to animate and get lessons from Eric. And I think the thing that I heard later, the thing that saved me, was there was a point where he took his coat off and rolled up his sleeves to punch the machine, and that felt natural. And that little, whatever that was, 6 seconds, was what got me another 8 weeks. I just made it through on the skin of my teeth. The Bluth thing was going on at that time. The Bluth guys all quit, and there was that war. Don had been a sequence director on Rescuers, and then he directed the animation for Pete's Dragon and a short called The Small One. And he developed an incredibly loyal following, really talented up-and-coming artists, including John Pomeroy and Linda Miller and Skip Jones and people like that. And the opposite side of the hall were the Brad Birds, the John Lasseters, the John Muskers, the CalArts crew. And they sort of, I think over the course of, and I wasn't there yet, so I can only, fill in from what I was able to figure out. But I guess there was a lot of division between the CalArts crew, who Don dubbed their group the Rat's Nest, because they didn't cooperate with him as readily as his own unit did. So there was a big division there. Don, overlapping with that time, started developing his own projects at his home and inviting people to come work with him on them after hours and on weekends, which, of course, all of his devoted followers did, but none of the CalArts guys wanted to do that. I don't want to define this era for anybody, so I'll just leave it at this. I think Don had an incredibly reverent and traditional approach to animation that really revered looking backward. And a lot of the guys that were the hires in what he called the Rat's Nest were people that wanted to push and do newer things. And, Don's thing was always embracing classical Disney as Disney. There really was no other point of reference for him. And the other group wanted to bring in, other influences and other ideas, even referencing something as seemingly innocuous as Chuck Jones or Looney Tunes to Don was heresy, because to Don Bluth, Disney was everything. Walt was everything. I think I sort of wound up on the wrong side of that. I'd gotten kind of stridently pro-Bluth in the middle of this war, and it was not the way to be if you wanted to stay at Disney. And I think that was probably finally what sank me. They figured, if you're so pro-Bluth, why don't you go work with him? And when they all quit, I was still too green and untried to be part of the exodus of that. So, I kept feeling like the turtle in Snow White. I kept feeling like I'd made it to the top of the stairs just as all the animals were coming running down. And I always felt like I was like a step behind everybody. I was really struggling. Even though I'd gotten through the program and everything, I was still pretty green compared to most of the other talent in the studio. So when I got let go, I wasn't surprised, but it was kind of devastating. The head of animation was a guy named Ed Hansen, who could be kind of a scary guy. He was affable enough, but he was a hard nose. He was, people toed the line when they'd walk down the hall. And when he let me go, I asked him if, it was possible ever to get hired back. And he said, well, from time to time that happens, but I don't think that's going to be the case. So, wow. So I got let go in November of 79 and managed to talk my way onto the Bluth crew. And I was at that studio for the next 5 years. I got to do some animation, nothing really spectacular. And then I also got into the story department, writing some of the sequences for Secret of Nim and then some other things. Then I left and I freelanced around for a couple of years. When I got hired back, Ed Hansen was still the supervisor at Disney, and he was the one who called me and offered me the job back because I'd submit a portfolio that passed. It just proves, time heals all wounds, I guess. I consider myself just lucky to be there. I was doing really nothing sensational on Oliver. I managed to pull off actually the best scene I did was of the poodle, but it got cut out of the movie. Katzenberg took the original directors off Beauty and the Beast and put Kirk Wise and Gary Trousdale on, and they liked me, and they saw me as Cogsworth and doing that character, which completely baffled me when they asked me to do it. I just didn't think Beauty and the Beast was a good idea. When I first heard we were doing it, I think part of it is my prejudice for the old Jean Cocteau black and white movie, which is so good. And I'd seen it a few years before. And I thought, why are we remaking a movie that's perfect? But we were, and I had problems with the character design. The shape of the body on Cogsworth was really awkward and difficult to draw, and his arms were too long. And they wouldn't let me alter it. And then finally there was a big blow up, and I finally said, just, give it to somebody else. And they said, well, take one more stab at what you think would be a good design. And, we'll see whether we can settle this. Ultimately, I solved the design problems to my own satisfaction to everyone else. And from that point on, I really had a ball doing the character. It was very rewarding because people were very complimentary of the work I did do on the movie. And the movie turned out great. Obviously, I was wrong. I would always sort of look down the road. I'm always nervous about what's coming next. So Aladdin was being cooked up in another building, and I had seen the treatment or the outline for it, and I liked the idea of the parrot character. It was kind of like a Cogsworth character. He was sort of a fussy, dry butler character again. And I asked John and Ron if they'd consider me for it, and they'd seen some of my footage of Cogsworth, which was a big improvement over what I'd been doing before. They said yes, and to make a long story short, I got to do Iago right after that, which back to back was two of my favorite projects ever. I didn't want to animate on some of the pictures coming up. I didn't like Lion King, and I didn't like Pocahontas, so I got into story on Hunchback. Then that led to a directing offer at DreamWorks. I was always on the short list to direct or co-direct, but never the actual bride. So I was kind of antsy to see what that was like. That's why I really finally left, which was ultimately kind of a disaster. And then it's been up and down ever since. The Road to El Dorado, if you want to call that a movie, which I was on for almost 3 years, and I resigned from El Dorado. Really, the less said about it, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
I got started in the film business like many of us do. I went to Cal Arts because I wanted to work in animation. It's the same old story. I grew up watching Warner Brothers cartoons. I loved those. Those were inspiring. I loved Bullwinkle and Rocky. I liked the Disney stuff. Ironically, not as much, but there are two big seminal things for me. Roger Rabbit and the New Adventures of Mighty Mouse, which Ralph Bakshi, John Kricfalusi were a big part of. Those were super inspirational for me. Then I was going to, at the time, an art school in downtown Denver, and there was a lot of animation festivals that were playing at a theater that was like right around the corner called the Ogden Theater. There were all sorts of cool movies. There were crazy, quirky things, and a lot of the films were from students that went to Cal Arts, people like Andrew Stanton, who went on to direct Finding Nemo, among other things. And so I thought, that's the place to go. Also, I saw an interview with Glenn Keane. He said he went to Cal Arts, so I applied and studied animation. I was in the same class as Craig McCracken, Gendy Tartakovsky. When you go into Cal Arts, every person that goes to Cal Arts was probably the best artist in their school. And then you discover that there's loads of people out there who are like super talented, and you have to raise your game on a daily basis. While at Cal Arts, I managed to make a couple of student films, one of which got into the producer's show, which is the big show that they put on there at CalArts for all the animation studios, and they come and they recruit. Kirk Wise and Gary Trousdale, they directed Beauty and the Beast, liked my film, asked me to submit a portfolio to Disney. They hired me as a story trainee onto Hunchback of Notre Dame, and that's how I got into Disney, as a storyboard trainee. Those guys were my mentors. The training was interesting because like at CalArts we had a class for story and storyboarding, but when you go to Disney features as a story trainee, they treat you like you're a story artist. They're like, here's your office, here's your desk, here's your paper, this is the supply room, here's your time card, all that stuff. They treat you like an employee, and you're invited to story meetings and you're encouraged to give ideas and all that stuff. It was kind of interesting to like have to, show up for work at 9 a.m. and stay till 6. Like Kirk and Gary gave me a scene. They were still developing Hunchback and they're still going through script revisions, but they gave me a section of the script and they said, board this, we want to see a rough pass in 2 weeks. That was the way I was trained. They would give me assignments like I was a real storyboard artist. They would critique me like I was a real storyboard artist. That's kind of how it was. And then we would have reviews where all the directors would get together and we'd have to pitch to them. We'd leave the room and then they'd talk about us and review us and say, he doesn't draw very well. But we managed to get through that training program and were promoted to real story artists in, I think, 6 months. And then we were thrown right onto production. Went right onto Hunchback of Notre Dame. That was the first movie I ever boarded on. It was interesting. I enjoyed it because Kirk and Gary are good directors. They're very supportive. They also let you, as a story artist, play. There are a lot of directors who, when you sit down with a sequence, they say, okay, let me tell you what I want. And they'll literally dictate the sequence to you shot by shot. Whereas Kirk and Gary will say, these are the emotional beats that we want to hit. Here's the dialogue. Some of it's great, some of it's not. If you have a better idea, pitch it. Go have fun. That's an amazing amount of rope that you can hang yourself with, or it's an amazing amount of freedom to like show what you can do. I was a young guy and I learned a ton, but that was my experience on that movie. Is I got to work with Will Finn, who's an animator on Cogsworth, animated Iago the Parrot. He had a story on that movie. I learned tons from Will. It was school all over again, but I got paid for it. Mulan ate up from 95 to 97. I think I was on Mulan, which included some time in Florida. Then I was on Atlantis as just a story artist, but later I was promoted to head of story. It was a fun movie to make. We were making a big, crazy action movie. I think the big problem we had and the big mistake we made was it was a plot-driven movie, and we didn't let the characters drive that movie. That was a big mistake. We were thinking in terms of it being a Disney action movie. And so if you put Atlantis next to, say, the action movies at the time, it doesn't really compete. It was a PG movie at the time, but if you put it next to, say, it doesn't compete with Star Wars, it doesn't compete with Indiana Jones. It's just kind of like filmically, it's really strong, as far as cinematography and how one shot leads into another, and all of those choices I think were really good. I don't think that the Atlanteans are that interesting still. That crystal, which we were in a room and we argued about it, I think we were erring on the side of ambiguity because if you remember correctly, The Phantom Menace had just come out. George Lucas decided to explain how the Force worked through midichlorians. We were kind of resistant to any super explainy reason as to why that thing worked and how it worked. And I think we went too far the other way. So it's not really clear what's going on with that thing. And after Atlantis, Don Hahn called me into his office and said, so what do you want to do next? And I said, well, I'd love to work with Kirk and Gary again, but I'm also keen to try directing something. I have a story idea. And so Don encouraged me to write it up and pitch it. So I pitched an idea for a superhero movie back in, I think this is 98, 99. I pitched it to then president of feature animation, Tom Schumacher. And Tom is interesting because I worked with a development exec named Leo Chu, who's an awesome guy, great exec, which you don't hear very often and you almost never hear from me. He warned me, he said, okay, Tom hates superheroes. And I said, why does Tom hate superheroes? And he said, he doesn't think they're emotional. He thinks it's too serious, and he doesn't think that they would work in animation because we've already seen them in live action. And I said, let me go away and write something that'll change his mind. Having worked with Chris on Lilo and Stitch, Chris developed Lilo and Stitch was really interesting because I'd never seen an animated movie developed this way before. He started with the two central characters and just kind of developed outward from there. All the plot, all the story came from the needs of those two characters and where he wanted to go with them. Everything was character, and relationship. So I sat down and tried to think of a relationship I wanted to tell a story about. And I went backwards and made a relationship story that happened to be about superheroes. And they responded to that really well. Unfortunately, Tom sat me down and said, okay, we're already making a superhero movie at Pixar. And that was The Incredibles. And he said, you've managed to accidentally reproduce certain plot elements from that movie. So we love this, but put it aside. What else do you have? And during the time I was trying to figure out what else I had, Sweating Bullets hit a story snag. The original story of Sweating Bullets was it was kind of like Captain's Courageous, only in the Old West. So the story is about this rich young guy from the East Coast whose dad sends him out to the Old West, and he gets kind of shoved into a cattle drive. It was kind of an amazing little story they had. It was all with people. The story centered on like an actual guy. They still had the talking rabbit in there, but they also had ghosts. The villains in the movie were these ghosts who were stealing cattle. And so you'd see all this amazing artwork in the hallway, and you'd say, wow, we're doing a Western with ghosts? That's cool. And Michael Eisner, when they gave him the big pitch, he went, oh, well, I thought this was going to be a movie about, like, cattle. Why don't you make the movie about one of the cows? And so they went, okay. They started making the movie about this little calf named Bullet that's on this cattle drive. So the whole movie shifted from the people down to this one calf named Bullet in the movie. So Michael back in those days was infamous for giving notes that like upended productions. Like on Chicken Little, for instance, when they first started making the movie, the character was played by Holly Hunter. It was a little girl chicken, and Michael, for some reason, couldn't wrap his head around a female protagonist. Michael is a fairly savvy business guy, but when he'd come into a creative meeting, he'd give like these really ham-fisted notes, to be honest.
For whatever reason, the studio gradually fell out of love with that story and added more people, and then they took the people out, and then they added more animals. And it was basically an animal story with a ghost villain. And then there was this almost mutiny in the story department with some of the newer story guys refused to embrace the ghost villain because how do you kill a ghost? And that became sort of a deadlock for months.
If your directors don't have the confidence behind their vision, story artists will eventually they'll revolt. It happens on a lot of productions. You'll have a little mini kind of coup. The management team was already seeing a movie that wasn't making sense. So the story team would like go into those meetings, those story meetings where everybody's there and just kind of hammer away at it until finally the management said, okay, this clearly isn't working. Everybody go away and come up with an idea for the movie. Literally, that's what they said. So everybody went away, and a couple of artists pitched the idea with the 3 cows trying to save the farm, which is what the movie became. And they said, great, go. That's the movie. That story was kind of forced on Mike and Mike.
Then it was at the point where it was, okay, you're up. You got to go into production. And at that point, I could tell Mike and Mike were really miserable on it, and they didn't really like it. I'm not very close with those guys, so it's not like I was talking to them. But I knew they were hating it. And the one thing I learned from directing on El Dorado was you cannot direct material you hate. They were just going through the motions in my view. Not that they weren't dedicated and talented, but they really felt robbed of the movie they intended to make. And they were now just, sort of being forced to make this other movie they didn't like.
And they tried to make that work until they couldn't and were removed. And I think that was a hard time. I think Mike and Mike kind of got a raw deal a little bit, but it's hard to say. I did say, and I believe this, that if they had given those guys the rope to make and the freedom to make that first movie they pitched with the guy and the ghosts, I think that could have been just as good a movie as Home on the Range. I think it could have been every bit as entertaining, maybe more so. I'd like to see that movie. On the other hand, I also say management was right to kind of move them off. They couldn't make any progress. So something had to change. And they decided to replace the directors. Nice though they were, Mike Gabriel is an amazing designer. Mike Giaimo is an amazing production designer and art director, but they couldn't get the movie to move forward. The movie was just awash in problems. And so they couldn't get the movie to go past Act 1. So they removed them and they brought in Will Finn.
And since I liked it, I thought, well, maybe if I like this concept, I'll be able to bring something to it. So when they asked me about it, I said, okay, because it was going to happen. I mean, I'd been around it that much to know the attrition level with directors. I think it engendered a lot of resentment between me and the Mikes, which probably exists to this day. I feel bad about that, but I didn't feel bad about taking over the movie because I could tell they didn't really want to make it, and I did.
They asked Will, who would you like to co-direct with? And Will said, how about John Sanford? And they said, okay. And that's how I got to direct Sweating Bullets, which later became Home on the Ranges. I kind of proved my mettle with both in story meetings on Atlantis and basically writing that treatment and pitching it. So they gave me a shot.
Oh, we'd been friends. John came in on Hunchback, but he was a new hire. That was his first full-time gig at the studio, and I always liked him. We always got along really well, and I could see they were trying to figure out where to bump him up to. So when I got offered that, I asked about it, and they said yes immediately. So we were already in production, and there was one sequence being made, and there was nothing really of the story that worked. So we were going to have to write the story as we went along, and it was just constant triage.
Oh, it was really hard, especially since Mike Giammo was my favorite teacher at Cal Arts. He taught me characters design for like 2 years, and I had to come in and like take over. And then there were some people on the crew that were happy to see us take over, and then there's some people who were outwardly hostile and didn't understand why we were there. And it's like, why are you here? Why are you promoted? And what was interesting is at the time I was 32. To most of the crew, just kind of promoted out of nowhere. They didn't know what I'd done. They didn't know me. I was younger than a lot of the folks I was directing. And that, as we all know, goes over real well. When you're telling a guy who's 10, 15, 20 years older than you are, has 15 years more experience than you do in the business, and you have to listen to some punk, that's hard for a lot of people to swallow. So what's interesting is that when I walk into situations like that, a lot of times I'm incredibly naive and don't see the problems. I'm kind of stupid that way. I just walked in and went, okay, this is what I'm doing, and didn't really see the problems until much later. I went, oh, wait, hey, I think these people don't like me. And with the story team, fortunately, with a lot of those guys, I'd worked with them before. And so they trusted us. And when they didn't, when they kind of had questions, I remember like Will and I had to go through a ton of meetings that first week. Will and I were with the story crew. We worked with them in the morning to work on a new beat outline that we were going to pitch to the executives later that week. And we had to go do some other things. And we said, okay, you story team and head of story and writers, work on this outline. We'll be back. I came back later that afternoon, and they were all sitting around the table kind of just silently. I said, so how's everything going? And I looked at the board, and they hadn't gotten past Act 1. And they said, well, we've got some problems. And they started telling me what the problems were. And I said, I hear you, but this is what we asked you to do. So do it. And I was basically too dumb to know that I was throwing my weight around, I guess. So, but that's what they needed. They needed somebody to tell them, I hear your issues. Let's just do what we agreed to this morning and just start moving forward. And once you have everything up, then we'll start to try and tear it apart. But what was interesting is this particular group of people would tear something apart before they could even get something done. If you ask any novelist, any writer, any musician, the hardest thing is just to get an idea on the page and get a complete thought on the page. So what you have to do is just get it down. Once it's down, once you've got everything up there, then you can tear it apart and edit and tweak and stuff. But if you're going to just say no to every idea that comes out of somebody's mouth, you're never going to get something done. And I think that was the problem with this particular group of people, is they just were really good at talking themselves out of ideas.
Oh, we fired somebody, which is not something I relish doing. And it wasn't like they were fired without warning. It was like there was a lot of sit down and let's talk this through. And yet we were still getting tons of pushback. This just sort of gets into the whole question of why did I say yes to this thing. I hate Westerns. I really think they're stupid, and it's just not. I'm not exactly a city boy, but I'm definitely someone bound for the great indoors. I'm not an outdoorsman or any of that, and the whole Western thing just never really. I kind of like the Italian spaghetti Westerns because they're just so off the wall. But we didn't play cowboys growing up. That was all very corny to me. So I was intrigued because I thought, well, we can make an inside-out Western. It'll be an anti-Western. Cows are the heroes and the cowboys are the bad guys. guys. I thought that was really funny. But in order to do that, you have to understand what a Western is. And it took me over a year to figure out what a Western is. I'm frantically, on my own time, reading about them and watching them. And basically, a Western is the lone individual against the group and the wilderness. And when I got that, finally, it's like, okay, well then everything in this movie will be about the opposite of that. This will be about a group against lone individuals, mercenaries. In the ideal of a Western, the lone individual is the classic individual. But by turning on its head, the individual becomes a mercenary. And so all the individual characters in the story are villains, and all the good characters are community. And that's something that I believe to an extent, but it's not something I believe, across the board. But I thought for the purpose of this story, we're going to say the community is good and the individual is suspect at best. If I'd known that earlier on, I think that would have helped. But that, for anyone who's bothered to sit through the movie, which is not that many people, that's what's happening all through the movie is individuals as mercenaries are making life difficult for community characters, and the community has to pull together to thwart them. And that sort of helped make sense for the cow story. It also made sense of the horse's story because the horse wanted to be, with the cowboy and be the lone gun and all that, but then he realized that guy was a fake and he had to come in and help the group and become part of the group. And when that sort of came out, someone in development wanted to make the horse have a speech about that. And I was just like, no, the whole point of the story is to make the point. If we have to stop and say it, then we're doing a bad job, which maybe we did anyway. So it was such a risky idea, even though nothing panned out, to make an anti-Western where everything about a Western was going to be called into question. So the cows, which are usually just passive background characters, are going to be the heroes. And they're also female. Westerns, of course, are dominantly masculine. And we're going to make 3 females the heroes against a wilderness full of hostile masculine characters. I liked all those things. And on a purely just silly level, the idea that cows would be the heroes of their own Western was funny to me because I like things that are silly. I'm a Gilbert and Sullivan fan, and they always do the topsy-turvy world where the things are turned on their heads, and that's immediately how I reacted to the story about the cows, was that we were turning a Western on its head. Was one of the things that appealed to me about the movie, because not only was it this topsy-turvy, a very silly story, but we had to do it for an extremely compromised budget, which isn't what shows up on paper, but a lot of the money that is always quoted for that movie was already spent. So we had to do this on a lot less money than a lot of the other movies that have been made. And I thought that would be appealing because it would enable us to do things that were a little bit sillier and take the movie less seriously. I think from Pocahontas on, there was a sense of grandeur and gravitas, which was a word that got thrown around a lot back then, about Disney movies that was starting to make me sick to my stomach, frankly. And the one thing that the Home on the Range story had was a complete absence of gravitas. And I thought, great, let's make, like a Woolly Reitherman type stupid movie. For better or worse, I kept thinking of the Woolly movies while I was making it. And those are terribly uneven movies too. And I guess I just misjudged public because, everyone wanted a full-on musical with a fairy tale and a princess and a prince. And, they really resented getting this stupid cartoon with Roseanne Barr and, a lot of uneven shenanigans. That's as much as I'll say about that.
There's a strange way that Disney makes movies. They kind of buy off on a plot, and then in the old days they used to approve it sequence by sequence into production. They would find what they call tent poles, and it was usually song sequences. If you're at all familiar with the movie Home on the Range, there's a song sequence called Little Patch of Heaven, where all the animals sing and dance and sing about how wonderful that dopey farm is that they live on. They had recorded that song with Katie Lang. They'd approved character designs. They'd approved backgrounds. And so they were fast animating and laying out and all that stuff for that sequence. So when I got onto the movie, I was told, okay, you can't touch this because this is already in. Everything else is fair game, but we're making this. This is going to help you set the style of the characters. It'll help set the style of the movie. And it's a song and we've got it. And so leave it alone. So we basically jumped onto a moving train. At the time, they were telling us that the casting was set in stone too, but we later learned that that wasn't true. One of the original cows was Grace the cow, which is the skinny yellow one, was voiced by Sarah Jessica Parker. We discovered that that wasn't working. It wasn't a clear characterization. And when we rewrote the character and made her a certain way, Will tried to record her, and she was like, I don't understand this. This doesn't make sense. And we hired Jennifer Tilly. And Jennifer Tilly came in and like, oh, I get it. I know who this is. Gotcha. Boom. And from the jump, Jennifer Tilly was great. Understood it. She's sharp. She always plays those kind of ditzy characters, but Jennifer Tilly is no dummy. Like, has a really smart way of approaching a dumb character, if that makes sense. And then the main character, Maggie the cow, was originally an actress named Jeanette Dubois, who some folks will remember from Good Times, that TV show from the 70s. She was good, but we just needed something different. So when we started rethinking the character Maggie, we're thinking, well, what if she's from another farm and she's bringing an alien point of view and she doesn't quite fit in? And I looked at the farm animals and how they were, and I said, you know what would really pop comedically? What if she was Roseanne Barr? What if that character was like Roseanne Barr and she comes in and Will said, well, why don't we try and hire Roseanne? I said, do you think they'll let us do it? And he said, well, why don't we try? What's interesting is Will gives me all the credit for the Roseanne thing. But I remember all I kept doing was saying, what if she was Roseanne? And I just kept trying to write the character as Roseanne. I really think it was Will who said, let's cast her. And I went, okay. Will likes to give me credit for that, but it was really the two of us in a room figuring it out. Some people love that choice and some people hate it. So whatever. The very first time I met with Alan Menken, I argued with him. And I was told that I should not argue with Alan. So after that, anytime I was in a meeting with Alan, I kept my mouth shut. So that was a please your boss moment. Here, there, and everywhere I've talked about Alan Menken. And I didn't enjoy a lot of my experiences with Alan because I was out of my depth. This comes as a surprise whenever I say this, having worked at Disney for 11 years. I'm not a fan of musicals. I don't like musicals, and I don't like songs in movies. For 11 years, I worked on musicals, even though I hated musicals. I can tell you how to set up a song, how to ramp into a song. I can board a song, and I could get out of a song, but I don't like them. Here I am working with a guy who writes songs for movies. And I'm telling him, I don't like it when characters break into song in movies. I actually said that to Alan Menken. This is a guy who has made some of the most famous songs in movies. He's got 9 Oscars. Here I am telling him that I hate what he does. That was me trying to be cool. That was me like saying, man, I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to tell this guy what's up. I was basically told, don't argue with Alan Menken like that. You can raise your concerns, and please don't. It's, that's not cool. Pretty much any time, like from then on when we were dealing with Alan, it was me in please your boss mode.
The worst thing about directing an animated movie for a big studio is it isn't really a creative job. It's a political job. And that's been my experience of it. And maybe that's, my failing as a creative person, but that's the way I always had to treat it. And I either survived or didn't based on my ability to understand the politics of doing it. One of the things I noticed at Disney during that time, in the Tom Schumacher years, was that as a director, you could defend your own idea once. You could defend anybody else's idea, as long as it was clearly someone else's idea, and you went to bat for it. But if you defended your own idea more than once, you were dead, because the director could only stand up for themselves to a point. And if you kept coming back to something you really wanted to do, then that meant you were, what do they call it, difficult. It's an incredibly stressful and tenuous job because there's tons of money on the line and nobody knows what's going to happen when the movie's done until it happens. And so nobody knows what the right decision to make at any given time is. Again, maybe it's just a failing of my own personality, but I always had to come across as someone who was a partner and a collaborator in a team rather than the person in charge, because that sort of thing didn't work for me. This is why so many production assistants become producers, is they won't fire a production assistant unless they're incredibly incompetent, which you don't get to be a production assistant unless you are competent, because they know where everything is. They know where all the numbers are. They know where all the scenes are. They know the flow charts. The director is just like, you don't know anything. you're just the person ostensibly in charge. So they can put anybody in and have them start taking orders. I don't mean to sound so cynical and negative about it, but obviously I didn't do a great job at it, and it wasn't fun. Well, the whole structure of directing on an animated movie at a studio, especially like Disney, is that you're in peril the entire time. I'm not saying this facetiously. You are the most replaceable person on the film. As they'd already demonstrated, they'd replaced the two directors before, and they would have happily replaced us at any given moment. And they nearly did. I know I was nearly let go at least twice, but I always found out after the fact. It wasn't like, it's like, oh, really? It's good. I just assumed we were on the razor's edge the entire time anyway. It was a couple of different things. I'd said the wrong thing the wrong way at the wrong time to the wrong person. And I'm pretty circumspect about dealing with people in charge. So, it was a surprise. One time wasn't a surprise because I just lost my temper and said something glib I shouldn't have said. But the other time was not. And I was like, really, over that? And then there were plenty of times where I saw the writing on the wall, and I took John aside and said, they're not asking us to do this, they're telling us. And we had to do things that really upset him. And, maybe I was being gutless, but I think I was basically just trying to get us through to the end, which is sort of the endurance chest is you get to put your name on the movie at the end. That's your consolation prize, I guess.
They kept saying, you're making a Western. I'm like, okay, cool. I know what a Western is, but you can't have guns. Okay, so a Western without guns. One of the reasons why they changed the movie from Sweating Bullets to Home on the Range is because McDonald's would not sell Happy Meals with the words sweating bullets on their Happy Meals. So that's why the title changed. One of the reasons why we knuckled under to McDonald's is that McDonald's represented $30 million of quote-unquote free advertising. If McDonald's is selling Happy Meals with your toys in them, then they get to play a clip of your ad, and that's literally $30 million worth of advertising. Great. Well, we got the cows. What's the biggest threat to a cow? Being turned into steaks and hamburger. Whoa. You can't do that. You can't threaten them with eating them. And I said, really? And I literally said this. I said, that's like making Finding Nemo, only Dad Fish is never threatened with being eaten. The whole movie, somebody's trying to eat that fish. And they even get swallowed by that whale at one point. Can you imagine Finding Nemo if the dad wasn't threatened with life or death? There were no stakes. That's part of the problem, is that there was no stakes in that movie. And, that's why it plays soft, and that's why it plays dumb. Whenever we would try and put any kind of threat into the movie or any type of edge, it would always get ground off. In the movie, we were like, well, what's the scariest thing Slim would do with an army of cows? And somebody said, I think it was, of all people, Ralph Sondag, who was just on the movie for 2 weeks. He's like, well, General Custer really wanted to be president of the United States. And we were like, whoa, what if Slim wants to take over the United States? And he's going to do it with an army of hypnotized cows. Maybe that's why he's stealing the cows. Maybe he was building an army so he can stampede Washington and insert himself as president. And that made him scary, that made him sinister, and it raised the stakes. But you got to remember, this is when we had a Texan literally steal the presidency of the United States. So we were told, no, that's too political, you can't do it. So we dropped it. And at a certain point, I just kind of resigned myself to at some point, I probably should have went in and said, you know what, this isn't for me, and I should have quit. Pixar at the time knew how to make movies about stuff that made people go, ooh, what's that? Like Monsters, Inc. It's about monsters. Right there in the fucking title, Monsters. Yeah, I want to see that. Incredibles. It's about superheroes. Fuck yeah. Nobody was making superhero movies back then except for Bryan Singer and those lame X-Men movies. When I heard about Finding Nemo, I'm like, what's Finding Nemo about? And they're like, well, it's about fish. And I went, oh. And they're like, yeah, it's about fish in the ocean, and his kid gets captured and put in a fish tank in Australia, and he needs to get him back. And I went, really? How the fuck is that fish going to get that little kid out of that tank? I want to see that movie. Just the problem is so insurmountable. It's like, this guy has to go there to get his kid back? Sign me up. I'll see that movie. Who gives a shit about 3 cows? We had a screening where Michael just didn't like the movie, and the movie was very close to being finished. And he said, you know what I think? Wouldn't it be funny if the whole movie was told from the point of view of those those stupid nephew guys. In the movie, the villain is Alameda Slim, and he's got these 3 idiot nephews. And for some reason, Michael got it in his head that the movie should be told from their point of view as a flashback, and they're in prison telling the story about how these cows bested them. And Will and I just went, oh my God. The interesting thing is that's kind of a funny idea, but when you've got 6 months left of production, you can't suddenly remake the movie. You just can't do it. So in the room, we told Michael, well, that's an interesting idea, but maybe not. That was the weekend before we went away. We had this big creative retreat where they had all the then current directors are flown to Michael Eisner's property in Aspen, and we were to talk about the future of Disney feature animation. So it's a bunch of execs, bunch of us directors, and we're in day-long meetings on Michael's beautiful property in Aspen, Colorado, talking about the movie. And so it's the last day, and they're like, hey, we have cake and pie. So I went and got myself a piece of pie and a cup of coffee, and I sit down at a table all by myself. And Michael Eisner, I don't think much has been made of this, but Michael Eisner is a massive human being. He's like 6'2", 6'3", just giant. He's got hands as big as pie pans. And he sits down next to me, and I'm not a big dude. I'm 5'10", and at the time I weighed 145. He sits down next to me, and it's like Andre the Giant sitting next to like Mean Gene Okerlund. He's just towering over me, and he says, tell me why we can't do my idea. And I had to carefully explain to Michael why we couldn't do his idea. All by myself. I looked to like, where's Will? Where's Tom Schumacher? They're like way across the way getting pie. And I had to little old me has to look Michael Eisner in the eye and tell the guy who can fire me with a stroke of a pen or just pick me up by my collar and my belt loop and throw me into the aspens. I have to tell him why we can't do his idea. And so I very calmly explained to him, well, Michael, we've been doing this and we've spent this much of the budget. And I tried to talk in his terms. He went, oh, okay, yeah, you're probably right. And he just left it be. I remember at the time when we did all the press for Home on the Range. This is years later, so I don't care. I'll say whatever I want. All the press kept asking us, is this the end of 2D? Is this the end of 2D? And of course we knew, yes, it's the end of 2D. All the animators were being retrained. This cleanup crew was being laid off. Home on the Range was going to be the last movie animated on paper. It was the last movie using that pipeline, using that system. It was very clear that we were going to make CGI movies from then on. I think it was 2 weeks in that Will intimated to me that he had a conversation with Tom Schumacher and they had decided that 2D was done at the studio and that they were going to move to CG, and that was just the way it was going to be. If the movie had made like $300-400 million, I don't think they would have gone back on that. I think they were ready to just move on to the next chapter.
That sort of leaked out gradually. And I think that's another thing, of course, in my view, that hurt the film tremendously because that became the story when the movie was released. This is the last 2D movie. And that was terribly embarrassing because nobody, including myself, wanted to see a tradition that started with Snow White, and Pinocchio and Fantasia, end with this little farce about cows. And early on, I asked if we could possibly make the movie in CG, and that was turned down flatly because I could just sort of see the way the world was going. I always felt that if the movie, it's kind of a moot point, if you had made the same film frame for frame as Home on the Range in CG and released in 2004, it would have made at least twice as much money, which is to say it wouldn't have been a huge hit, but it would have done better because CG had such a novelty at that point that almost any CG picture was getting an enormous pass.
So we all knew at that retreat, there was no arguing. I think the only person who said, I really think the public needs to see drawings was Glenn Keane. Glenn was the only one who's still kind of really pulling for that system. And God bless him. I think in a way Glenn's right, but at that time, the public just didn't care. Iron Giant came out and it was poorly promoted, but it was a great movie that at the time nobody went and saw. Lilo and Stitch came out. Lilo and Stitch is arguably one of Disney's greatest movies, and it did moderately well at the box office. It was Chris Montan, who was the head of music, said to Roy Disney, if Lilo and Stitch were a CG movie, it would have made $300 million. And Roy said, well, don't say that too loud. These guys aren't ready to hear that yet. Roy knew. Roy had his eye on the future. The public had kind of cooled on 2D animation. That can be argued that was a thing. People were just kind of, what else is out there? And then when you would put out a movie like Bug's Life, which is not a great movie, but it made tons of money. people got excited about it now because there's an immersive quality to CG. It was understood at that retreat that that was going to be our future. The most contentious points at that retreat was what kind of movies going forward, what kind of stories. I remember arguing vehemently that Disney had kind of lost touch with the culture at large. There was a thing that Disney at the time did, and they finally got past it. Disney had a problem at the time of thinking only in terms of Disney. Like when we were making Atlantis, this is Disney's big action movie. When they made Treasure Planet, this is our science fiction movie. And they didn't seem to understand that outside the walls of the studio, people were making action movies and science fiction movies that were like far more daring, far more interesting. Hercules came out, and the very same weekend, Men in Black came out. And I think it was Ed Gombert that said, you know what? Men in Black should have been the movie we made because it was interesting, it was dynamic, it captured the minds of the public because it was a way of seeing the world that they weren't used to. Whereas Hercules was, it's another one of those. It was another one of those Disney musicals, and there's 5 songs, and who gives a shit? That was kind of the wake-up call. We put what we thought was our best foot forward as a company, and nobody cared. A lot of that retreat, I remember, was just discussing what does the public want from us? What should we be making? And I can't remember whether I don't think we ever came down on anything. It was a really crazy, strange weekend because we'd have these meetings, and then Michael put us up in a house bigger than any house I've ever lived in. In order to get to where the meeting was, they gave us an SUV that was parked out front.
It's a group bonding thing. It was very, it was 2.5 days we desperately needed to get work done that we couldn't work. I just wanted to get back to the studio. I remember they made us sing karaoke at one point, and I refused. And I think at one point, Roy Disney, who was as turned off by the karaoke as I was, sort of looked at me like, you want to give it a go? And I let it pass. So I never got a chance to sing karaoke with Roy Disney, which I half regret and half feel like maybe it was the right thing to turn down. John picked the song on for my behalf, which was very nice of him. They picked the song Life's Been Good to Me So Far by Joe Walsh.
Generally speaking, previews went well. Overall, we had good scores. They were like, would you see the movie when it comes out? Yes. Would you recommend this movie to a friend? Yes. Overwhelmingly, our scores were positive. Now, that means jack shit, truthfully, because if you put out a movie and folks that don't know about the movie look at your poster and go, I don't care. To be perfectly honest, it was a movie I wouldn't see. If I saw our poster, if I saw our billboards driving around in California at the time, I was 32 years old. I didn't have kids. I wouldn't want to see it. What's interesting is that most people say, well, who cares? You're a 32-year-old man who gives a shit. But even as a 25-year-old guy dating, I wouldn't take my date to see Home on the Range. I would have taken a date to see Aladdin. I would have taken a date to see Beauty and the Beast. I would take somebody to see Lilo and Stitch. Me and my wife went and saw Ice Age opening weekend. Home on the Range didn't appeal to people. I remember Tom Schumacher at one point said it plays young and dumb. So it plays for little kids. And there are folks at Disney who said, well, good, because that's our core audience. And I used to say, no, that's not, Jeffrey Katzenberg knew well enough to know that when they made Little Mermaid, they said, you're not competing with other animated movies. You're competing with the latest Tom Cruise movie. You're competing with Top Gun. That was a smart, savvy thing to say. And what was interesting is when I sat down with the marketing people and we were about to release Home on the Range that weekend, we were going up against Hellboy. And I said, well, we're going to lose all the audience to Hellboy. And they were like, that's really not our audience. And I said, bullshit, that's not our audience. Those are people with money. People with money, you should want to try and get everybody into your movie. Back then, nobody wanted to hear that, but Jeffrey knew it. I think the company understands it now. But back then, they thought the core audience was 10-year-olds. That's why Disney nearly shut the lights off. Home on the Range didn't make money. Chicken Little didn't make money. There was a long, dry period of years there where the company was in trouble. And it's because they did not understand who their real audience was.
One of the last memories I have of the movie is when marketing was doing the trailers. They showed us a bunch of trailers, and one of them was nonlinear. And it was like, yes, this will sell this movie. And the others were all very straightforward. This is the story of a cow, and it's just, and the nonlinear one was Eisner's pick. And I was like, well, we agree with Michael, and we thought that would get it over. But marketing vetoed Michael and us and got linear trailers out, which was depressing.
when I still had my office there in that hat building, the director's offices were made in such a way that if you were agile enough, you could actually jump up on top of those offices. And I jumped up on top of my office and I took a Sharpie and I wrote in 2004, and I gave the date that we approved our last scene. We completed the very last hand-drawn animated movie that Disney will ever make, and I signed it. And that doesn't mean anything because they gutted that whole floor and threw everything away. They had an animation open house, and when I was between jobs, we were there on the second floor in what they call now the caffeine patch, which is, they renovated that building and it looks nothing like it did when I was there. And I swear I stood exactly where my office was, and I think there was a foosball table there and a bunch of chairs, and it's just different. It's all different now. We got everything done on time. We delivered it under budget. I'm going to tell tales out of school. We had a budget of $125 million for that movie because that's what animated movies cost back then. And we delivered it, I think, at 115, maybe 120, because we were told to kind of hold the line and try not to overspend. And we did what we were told. When you finish one of these movies, you're extremely happy. It's a jubilant time. So the premiere was lots of fun. The thing was that you don't realize until much, much later that whether you've got a failure or a success. So everybody treats it like it's a success. We walked down the red carpet. I met Leonard Maltin, who I loved. Maltin reviewed it, and Maltin liked it. He thought it was a great movie. He told me that we had a movie that felt like one of the classics. I've had people tell me that since, they respond to the look of the movie, which I think the look of the movie is flawless. The art direction is great. David Cutler and the background painters did a really great job with the look. Joe Mosier was the character designer, and he happened to capture a really classic yet stylized look for that movie. Story-wise, it's at least coherent. Maltin said he really enjoyed it. I think that other critics weren't so kind, and rightfully so. Good or bad, we delivered the movie. It didn't perform. I think that the company was okay with just saying, okay, that's that chapter of animation done. We'll close the book and we'll move on. There are two different ways it used to go. Under Tom Schumacher and Jeffrey Katzenberg and Peter Schneider, because they understand that it's a collaborative medium, a lot of the way the movie is because of the notes they give. Tom Schumacher was very fond of saying, we're going to join hands and take this step forward together. And what that meant was it was a team effort. And if the team won, the team won. And if the team lost, it was a team failure. He truly believed that the success was a team success, failure was a team failure, and you couldn't pin it on any one person. That was his philosophy. David Staten, on the other hand, you could tell that when the movie came out and the movie didn't perform, what was interesting is that our standing fell dramatically. Suddenly we weren't invited to meetings anymore. Will was pitching an idea for a movie, and I don't think it was received very well. I pitched an idea for a movie, and they were like, thanks, but no thanks. It was very clear that that regime, run by David, if your movie didn't do well, he was going to dump it in your lap. Pretty easy to blame us for the failure of that. He's like, well, it was begun under Tom, and these two idiots, it was obviously their fault, and we're not going to let them direct another movie, so yay. I worked on one more movie after that. It was pretty clear that they weren't really interested in having me around, and I wasn't interested in being there anymore. So when I left, it was mutual. They offered me a bunch of things, and I was like, no, I'll just go. So I left.
Well, he was there for a couple of years after. I was let go right away after the movie came out. We kind of went our separate ways, after the movie finished. And the movie was really wrapped 6 months before it came out. And John was already developing other stuff, and, we were friends, but we weren't comparing notes. And he'd made it clear he didn't want to collaborate again. So, not with me anyway. So, whereas I think there's a good version of that movie, I don't know if John feels the same way. I think John basically said yes, and I don't want to speak for him, but John wanted the opportunity to direct and was willing to do it with me, and so we did it together. But I think on some level he's probably more regretful about the whole experience than I am.
I look back on it, I can't watch that movie because to me it reflects a lot us trying to please our bosses, and it also, I think there's a lot of learning that I did. But there's also stuff I'm very proud of in that movie. There are jokes I can point to, there are sequences, there's characters that I can point to that I go, I did that. That's my influence.
If there's one thing that makes Disney Disney, it's its ability to transport viewers from their own harsh reality to wonderlands, where happily ever after is just around the corner. It's a formula that's worked wonders since 1937. Interestingly enough, Home on the Range had all the elements that Disney uses to create magical illusions. Talking animals, songs, villains, heroes, and that Disney happy ending. However, Home on the Range doesn't manage to capture that blinding Disney magic. Because the film fails to take the viewer on the immersive vacation from reality, it actually grounds them in the stark reality of life. A reality in which you spend every day wondering if you'll be fired. A reality in which cows taking over Washington is too political. A reality in which McDonald's has a significant creative input on art. The circumstances that John and Will encountered were begging for that Disney happy ending that never came. Instead of that happy ending, there are innumerable questions about the elusive nature of magic.
I never hated it. Like I said, I always felt good about the things that appealed to me about the movie. It was difficult to be objective about the movie itself while making it because we were so steeped in it for so long. It's such an intense period. I think there's a good version of that movie. We just didn't manage to find it. I actually would like to think that under the right circumstances where fewer things were going drastically wrong, and probably at a different studio, you could make that story into a very entertaining movie.
Like, I don't have any complaints about anybody on that movie. I think everybody worked hard. I mean, that's kind of the lesson there. Everybody did their best, and yet the movie's not that good. That's the sort of thing that fascinates me, the fact that people can work so hard, and everybody's trying hard, and there's no laziness at all. You know, everybody's doing their damnedest, and yet the movie comes out, it's not that good.